Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming in. We're going to give it just a few minutes to let people get in the webinar and get situated, and then we'll start with our introduction. So thanks for coming. I would encourage all of our attendees to open up their Q&A box and their chat. You can find that in the Zoom panel. During our presentations tonight, we encourage you guys to ask questions that we'll cover in the discussion section of the webinar today. So thanks for joining, welcome, and we'll start in just a couple minutes as you all come on in. Welcome everybody to Intersections of Environment and Justice, From Our Bodies to the Earth, a webinar series brought to you in collaboration with Biosphere 2 and the Arizona Institutes for Resilience. I'm Aaron Bouget, and I'll be moderating the webinar series. A little bit about the series. Intersections of Environment and Justice brings together the Fall 2020 Carson Scholars cohort of graduate students to discuss the future of food, management and reuse of resources, environmental, health, and social justice, and environmental stresses and climate impacts. In 4 one-hour webinars, the 12 scholars detail the challenges facing communities around the world and innovations that could impact the way we interact with the planet and each other. Today's webinar is titled The Future of Food. We have 3 panelists joining us this evening. Becca Waller is a 3rd-year PhD student in the Biosystems Engineering Department. Her expertise and research is a blend of engineering and plant science, engaging with novel technologies to grow plants for food in controlled environments. Becca is currently looking at semi-transparent, thin film solar cells for application as a greenhouse covering material, with the overall goal of designing more energy efficient and cooler looking food production systems. Zia Kaya is a PhD student in the School of Anthropology. His work examines digital agricultural technologies and socioeconomic and agroecological changes, particularly in Turkey. As a social scientist, he employs ethnographic methods to observe the lives of farmers, plants, soils, scientists, and data technologies. Julia Davies is a PhD student in the School of Geography, Development, and Environment. She works in a multidisciplinary research team and uses survey and interview data to understand the dynamics of urban food systems. Today, Julia will discuss food insecurity in South African cities and examine whether urban agriculture can solve this complex challenge. Welcome, Becca, Zia, and Julia.
Thanks, Aaron. Hi, everyone.
So before we proceed, I'd like to take a moment to thank our individual Carson Scholars Program donors, and from our University of Arizona sponsors, Biosphere 2, the College of Engineering, College of Science, College of Behavioral Sciences, and the Graduate College. And lastly, I'd like to thank our webinar mentors, Kevin Bonine, Chris Kokinos, and Andrea Gerlach, and Maya Patterson, who's been a major force in helping us organize this webinar series. So our 3 panelists will present back to back to back, during which we will hold all of our questions until after the presentations for a follow-up discussion. Again, I would encourage you all to submit questions to the Q&A box throughout the talks. Also, we love to know where you're listening in from, so drop us a hello and where you're from in the chat box as well. I'll be drawing from these questions and responses throughout the discussion. And with that, I'll turn it over to Becca, Zia, and Julia.
All right. So welcome everybody to the future of food. And once again, my name is Rebecca Waller. and I'm going to be talking to you all this evening about how and why you should tattoo your greenhouse with semi-transparent solar panels. But before we get into what semi-transparent solar panels are and why I'm calling them greenhouse tattoos, let's just talk about farming for a minute. This is Waltham Fields Community Farm. It's located just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. And I actually worked here for a couple of years during undergrad and immediately after in the field crew there. And Waltham Field Community Farm members can come and through the Community Supported Agriculture Program, pick up weekly shares of vegetables and other farm products. There's educational programs where kids can come and learn about sustainable farming practices and environmental issues. And this is how it looks in the winter. Pretty much the farm is out of commission from November to March, sometimes April. And I want us all to start thinking about where Waltham Fields Community Farm members are getting their vegetables in the off season. A little bit closer to home, this is Tucson Village Farm, and it's a working urban farm created by and maintained by Tucson youths. And it's a great way to reconnect young people to a healthy food system. But what about in the summer, especially the one that we just had? It's virtually impossible to grow most vegetables in that kind of heat. So whether it's because of excessive cold or excessive heat, we need a way to grow plants. And greenhouses are a way to do that. This is Waltham Fields Community Farm's latest greenhouse build, actually. And they use it as a season extender to, for example, plant seedlings in early spring and extend production later into the fall. And back in Tucson, you see in the middle here the research greenhouse facilities at the Controlled Environment Agriculture Center, which is where I do my research, actually. And in these facilities, students and faculty are experimenting with novel technologies to grow vegetables like the ones you see here in controlled environments. So the main takeaway is that whether it's because you're in a New England winter or a Tucson summer, most of us at some point during the year need controlled environments to cultivate plants, to grow food. And controlled environments is a flexible term. It can mean greenhouses, which we're going to be discussing more in depth. It can mean your own house. It can mean simple shade structures or massive urban warehouses with indoor farms. And each of these forms of controlled environment agriculture has its own applications and advantages. But focusing more specifically on greenhouses, it comes with a cost to produce crops inside of a greenhouse. And just behind labor, actually, energy is the top cost for greenhouse growers. So like we like to do in our own houses, keep ourselves comfortable, you need to maintain an adequate growing environment inside of the greenhouse for plants. And in order to do this, you need to run heating, cooling, ventilation systems, and all of those require massive amounts of energy to run. So if you compare what it takes to grow plants in a greenhouse versus in a more conventional setting in the field, you can start to see the pros and cons of either method, of either system. And what this study did was look at the inputs and outputs of greenhouse-grown lettuce versus field-grown lettuce in Yuma, Arizona, which is one of the top lettuce producers in the country. And you can see here that the yield coming out of the greenhouse hydroponic system per unit area, per meter squared, was significantly higher, 90% higher than what was coming out of the field. Water use efficiency was greatly increased in the greenhouse system, using less than 10% of the water that was used to grow lettuce in the field. But if you look at the energy consumption of either system, the energy consumption in the greenhouse was orders of magnitude higher than what it was in the field, in the conventional farming system, because you're running all of those components that we just talked about. So that brings us to a dilemma, which is, we know greenhouses have many different advantages and applications, but they're highly energy intensive systems. So one solution, and what's been the focus of my doctoral research, is what I'm calling tattooing your greenhouse. And what I mean by a greenhouse tattoo are these semi-transparent solar panels, which work photovoltaics, synonymous with solar panel, which is just saying it's a device that converts light into electricity. These are emerging, unique photovoltaic materials. You can see through them. They're semi-transparent. You can deposit them onto a variety of different substrates like glass or plastics. So they can be flexible. They can be a variety of different colors and also extremely lightweight. And compared to conventional solar panels, like silicon solar panels, for example, it's extremely cheap to fabricate these materials. So people are excited about it and thinking about integrating them onto a variety of different surfaces, such as building windows, car windows, other facades, and greenhouse covers, with the idea that we want to transform surfaces otherwise unused into solar energy harvesting and renewable electricity generating surfaces. So when thinking about tattooing your greenhouse with these photovoltaic tattoos, there are some questions that need to be answered. And these are the questions that we're trying to answer in our photovoltaic integrated greenhouse research at the Controlled Environment Agriculture Center. Some of these questions include: how much power can these devices produce? How much do they cost? What's the best way to install them? How long do they last? 3 days, 6 months, 5 years? And after the usable lifetime of the material, how do you get rid of it? Is it recyclable? Is it recoverable in any way? And thinking about the greenhouse system itself, what is the crop response to being grown underneath the shade caused by these integrated semi-transparent solar panels? In many areas, such as the southwestern United States, shade cloths are actually needed for greenhouse crop production in the hotter months. So it could actually be a benefit. So again, these are the questions that we were looking at when devising our photovoltaic integrated greenhouse study. So for our study, we were looking at this unique type of semi-transparent photovoltaic tattoo called an organic photovoltaic, or OPV. And these were commercially available, large-scale OPV rolls that we then deployed on a high tunnel greenhouse at my research center. And we basically took this concept that was born in a lab and a lot of academics are excited about, and applied it to a real greenhouse setting. And in this study, we were looking at the energy generation potential of these devices. We were looking at what the response of a tomato crop was to being grown underneath the shade of these solar panels, and what the effect on the greenhouse microclimate was. And in answering these questions, we are trying to figure out essentially how we can best optimize the integration of this emerging PV technology into greenhouse structures to create more energy efficient, sustainable food production systems. So if you come away with one thing from this presentation, it should just be that photovoltaic integrated greenhouses, like we just discussed, mean nutritious food and renewable energy year-round. This is my email. We have time for discussion at the end of the webinar, but if you have any questions about food production system design or food system in general, please reach out. And these are the sources that I used for my presentation. And so you just heard from me about food production system design, but you're going to be hearing from Zia and Julia about a couple different perspectives to take when thinking about the future of food. So with that, I will turn it over to Zia. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much, Becca. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Zia Kaya, and I am a PhD student at the School of Anthropology, University of Arizona. Today, I'm going to talk about digital agriculture in Turkey and the questions that I'm pursuing for my research at the intersection of agroecology, livelihood, and technology. As you know, we are under a global digital transformation, and agriculture is not an exception. And digital agriculture is also known as Agriculture 4.0, named after Industry 4.0 strategies declared by Germany in 2011. And like Industry 4.0, Agriculture 4.0 also aims to digitize, automate, and customize agricultural production and marketing. As you see from this picture, currently we have digital agricultural data collection technologies like drones, sensors, and satellites. Some farmers are using them in their farms and collecting some data of their farms through these technologies. But what are they going to do with this data? They are actually kind of presented as confused farmers, as in the picture, and overwhelmed by data. So some initiatives, private and public initiatives, aims to use these data through big data, algorithmic big data technologies to produce some predictive insight about the farms, for example, about plant anomalies, soil anomalies, and weather conditions, and also recommendations about farming, like about the irrigation, pesticides use, and marketing, like market price and blah, blah. So through these insights, through this digital knowledge, actually, it's believed that farmers will get rid of their confusion. So according to World Government Summit, global investment in agricultural technology between 2010 and 2015 increased by 82%, actually. So in this increase, we see some countries like United States, UK, Netherlands, Japan, and Israel as the leading countries. But also we know some countries are investing into digital agricultural technologies like Kenya, Argentina, and Turkey. Turkey is significant, I believe, because it is the around the 7th largest agricultural producer, and also Turkey recognized 2020 as the year of digital transformation in agriculture. And what has Turkey been doing actually in the sense of digital agriculture? In Turkey, various private and public collaborations have been undertaking actually various projects in the sense of digital agriculture. For example, some projects includes the digitization in agricultural market, digitization in agricultural registration, digitization in agricultural administration, and also digitization in agricultural production. For my research, I'm focusing on the production part. And specifically, I'm questioning the impacts of the digitization in agricultural production on the agroecology, namely the farmer's relationship with soils, crops, plants, weather conditions, the climate, and also the animals and others, and also impacts of these technologies on their livelihoods, mainly incomes, considering these technologies might be costly actually. And so far in my research, I have observed that these, for example, from the first picture here, these private and public initiatives providing some sensors, like in the first picture, to the farmers, and these sensors are located in the farms, and these sensors are collecting data like about the plants, weather conditions, and soil as well. So and other technologies as well. I'm just here presenting a couple of examples. So these data collected through these sensors are analyzed through the big data algorithms, as I said before, actually. And then farmers are suggested, recommended actually, or given some predictive insight about their farming practices. And then farmer will be just the decision makers based on these information produced by big data algorithms from the big data sets. Also, like in the, I have seen in my research, like in the second picture, farmers are using these ankle monitors called podometers. And these podometers are counting the steps of the cows. And by this way, they are actually detecting anomalies, some health-related anomalies in the cows, and then inform the farmers through text messages or some applications as well. And then the farmer expected to take action to take care of their cows. So these are the examples from my research, actually. As an ethnographer, I am, actually a social scientist, I'm planning to conduct an ethnography in private-public collaborations, startups, and online platforms like applications, which are the parts of digitization in agriculture. And I am planning to, specifically, I'm planning to question actually the interviews and conduct the participant observations with farmers to learn how they benefit from these technologies and if they change their production and production practices and relations with environment, and also how they earn their livelihoods through these technologies, through these digital technologies. I believe that this research is really significant because, as we have been going through some global critical issues like the food insecurity is increasing, as Julia will talk about it, and the agricultural lands are decreasing, and environmental degradation is also increasing. Population is increasing, and in some rural areas, for example, in Turkey, older populations is becoming the dominant actually in the rural areas. And also for farmers, input cost is really increasing, and considering these technologies, it is a big unknown as well. So, and digital agriculture is promoted to address these significant issues, these global, significant global issues actually. So I believe that it is significant to question the impacts of these technologies on the environment and also the welfare of the farmers in the midst of such a huge hype for the digitization in the world. So that's all. Thank you very much. And now Julia will going to present her work.
Okay, there's slide number 1. So when you think about food insecurity in Africa, you may conjure up images of drought-stricken rural villages on the brink of famine. In fact, when I Googled the words food insecurity in Africa, these were some of the first images to be returned. These pictures paint a scene that's very commonly portrayed in the media and by NGOs and development organizations. It's also this story of rural hunger, smallholder farming, and the impact of climate change on agriculture that has shaped much of the research and policy agenda of food insecurity in Africa. The solutions, according to the last several decades of research and policy making on this topic, are therefore to invest in rural development, upscale agricultural output, and distribute food aid to famine-affected areas. Although these rural interventions may be necessary, Africa is an increasingly an urban continent. Today, there's about 350 million people living in cities and towns of sub-Saharan Africa alone, and this figure is expected to triple to 1 billion by 2050. Interestingly, much of this urban growth is actually taking place in smaller urban areas, like those indicated on this map of Southern Africa, rather than in large primary cities, like Lusaka in Zambia or Johannesburg in South Africa, for example. While urbanization is partly an organic process, another major driver is rural to urban migration. This is because city life is often imagined by those living in rural villages to mean economic prosperity and social well-being. So every year, many people pack up their belongings and settle for the nearest urban oasis in search of modern technologies, better infrastructure, access to housing, healthcare, education, and food. But having grown up in urban South Africa, I know that for many people, life in African cities is tough. This is because the economies of countries like Zambia, Kenya, Botswana, and South Africa, where I'm doing my PhD research, have not developed as quickly as the urban populations have. So struggling local economies mean that job opportunities for unskilled workers, much like the rainfall, have dried up. And so people's dreams about living this modern urban life have not come to fruition. And instead, millions of people are living in overcrowded, underserviced slum areas on the margins of cities. One major consequence of this urban poverty is urban food insecurity. This occurs when people don't have enough safe and nutritious food to meet their daily needs and those of their household. Rather than being a problem of only food availability and supply, hunger and malnutrition in African cities is usually linked to the fact that people can't actually afford to buy food that they need to maintain an active and healthy lifestyle. So while supermarket shelves may be heaving with bags of maize meal, fresh produce, and broiler chickens, this food often remains inaccessible to low-income urban consumers, who might find themselves surrounded by food, yet haunted by hunger. This problem becomes even worse in times of drought, because as rural farmers' yields go down, food prices in cities go up. To help feed their families and even supplement their income, some people grow crops like tomatoes or cabbages, or keep chickens or small livestock like goats, usually in their backyards, but also in other open spaces like alongside roads or on vacant public land. We call this urban agriculture, which is an activity that is often promoted as this almost cure-all solution to hunger and poverty in cities. But is this really the case? With a survey in hand, I visit low-income communities in sub-Saharan African cities to investigate whether urban agriculture could be the answer to Africa's food insecurity problem. What I've found from my research in Kenya and Zambia so far is that although urban agriculture may be possible for some households, the reality is that most people are not producing any of their own food. To help you understand why, I'd like to tell you about the time that I met Mr. Musonda, who's an elderly Zambian man who I came across tending his vegetable garden while I was walking through a dusty informal settlement in the town of Choma last year. After chatting to him for a while, I asked Mr. Musonda why more people are not following his example by growing food for themselves. He explained that there are many challenges when it comes to doing this. He showed me the hand-dug well that his grandson helped him build on his property, and pointed out that most people living in informal settlements like this one don't have easy access to water. They walk for miles each day to fill their buckets at communal taps and boreholes. Many people are also renting their dwellings or even squatting, and so don't have the land rights or security of tenure that come with property ownership. Because of this, they don't want to invest in a home garden. They might get evicted and have to move again. Now, while I was talking to Mr. Musonda, a lady whose name I learned was Cynthia stopped to try and sell me some salted groundnuts. After purchasing a few small bags, I asked Cynthia whether she, like Mr. Musonda, grows her own food. Cynthia told me that she would love to grow some vegetables and even keep a few small chickens, but her neighborhood is dense and overcrowded, and she doesn't have the space or the resources that she needs. Cynthia also wondered when she would find the time to invest in a home garden. She's a widow with 3 school-going children, and she has to spend her time earning a cash income that will feed her family today, rather than spending it on trying to grow tomatoes or spinach that might only be ready to eat in several weeks' time. As the story illustrates, it's often the people who could benefit the most from growing their own food that have the least capacity to do so. Instead of engaging in urban agriculture, most people living in African cities purchase their food from a combination of traditional open-air markets, informal kiosks, roadside vendors, and also fast food outlets, and increasingly from supermarkets. This very high reliance on purchased food means that low-income households are very sensitive to even small rises in food prices, and to the price of things like fuel or public transport as well. And an unexpected expense, like a medical bill, for example, can force them to make difficult trade-offs, such as either buying food or paying for school fees. Some scholars argue that urban food insecurity is now one of the biggest challenges that is facing African governments today. Yet, the plight of urban consumers is often overlooked, and food security research and policy continues to maintain this rural bias that we've seen in the past. My PhD research aims to fill this gap in knowledge, and in doing so, help to fill the food gap in hungry African cities. Thanks so much for listening. Back over to Erin, I guess, or open up for questions.
Yeah, thank you all for presenting. So we will head into our discussion now, and I encourage all of our attendees who have been saving those questions to go ahead and add them to the Q&A box. I'd like to start with a question from Kevin Finnegan for Becca. Kevin asks, what type of storage device is used in conjunction with the photovoltaic tattoos? Becca, could you speak to that, please?
For the ones that thanks for the question. For the photovoltaic tattoos that we used in our study, we were actually we were using them for data collection. So they were hooked up to an IV current voltage curve measurement system and weren't actually powering anything, for research. But in a conventional setting, if you were to actually integrate these into a greenhouse, they function similarly to other solar panels, and you just use a conventional battery storage system.
And while we're on the subject, Becca, we have a question from Joost van Haren. How efficient are the OPV panels, and how much energy use could they offset?
So these are all the questions that could have populated that web of questions around photovoltaic greenhouse tattoos. The ones that we used in our study, again, commercially available, large scale, average efficiency was less than 2%, actually. So if you compare that to commercially available conventional solar panels, you're seeing efficiencies in those around 20 to 30%. So you're like, why the heck are we even looking at these to power greenhouses? The idea is future minded. And if you look at trends in efficiencies and in this particular type of photovoltaic technology, these thin film, semi-transparent photovoltaics, it's only increasing, and it's increasing a lot faster than conventional solar panels. So people are thinking about already the applications of these materials as we're waiting for efficiencies to increase. And it's expected that they will significantly in the next 10 years.
Great. We have a question from Diana Liverman. Could the presenters, who were great, talk about how the pandemic has affected, changed, disrupted their research, and or how COVID is affecting the communities where they work and intersecting with food security? Why don't we start with Zia and Julia on that prompt?
Sure, Zia, do you want to go? I can go.
Yeah, you can go. Go ahead, please.
Sure. Yeah, some very clear implications around COVID. So just in terms of our field work, the research team that I'm a part of, some of whom I think are in the audience, our work is of course in Southern Africa. So this year over the summer, we were planning to go to Botswana and South Africa to conduct our household survey, which is the main data collection tool that we use. But unfortunately, because of COVID and travel restrictions and that whole story, we had to cancel. And our intention was to adapt to actually do a phone call survey with the same households that we visited in Zambia last year, because we got all their phone numbers. But yeah, we're still working on getting that done, but looking to definitely go to the field next year if it's possible. And then, yeah, just in terms of how COVID's affected food security in the countries and in the cities that we work in, I think the major impact has been the job losses that people have experienced and the closure of many businesses. And as I spoke about in my presentation, food security in these places really depends on people's ability to afford food and access the food that they need. So without a steady income and without, you know, a lot of people work as like informal laborers to doing what we call piecework, which might mean like going and working on a construction site for a day, or going and cleaning a house for a day, or kind of whatever piecework they can find. And without that kind of income, they aren't able to buy food. So I know in South Africa, like just having spoken to my family and followed the news there, food insecurity is becoming a huge, huge impact of COVID. We do have a lot of NGOs trying to come in and help with the situation, but there is, of course, a major gap. And one of the big kind of failures that we've seen is from the governance side. So just an example, again, from South Africa, is that in the informal settlements where, as I said in my presentation, like millions of people live in these very, very dense, overpopulated conditions, they often access their food by going to like backyard shops, which we call spaza shops, or by having to travel all the way into town to go to a supermarket. And as part of the government restrictions due to COVID, the government actually said that no spaza shops can be open, and the public transportation was like very much reduced, or in some cases like even eradicated for a period of time. This prevented people from buying food in their own communities and also from like traveling to buy food. So there were huge kind of breakdowns there, and it's definitely had a massive impact that I think will be lasting. But the positive side of that is that it has highlighted these issues that now hopefully we can work towards rectifying.
And Zia, do you want to speak to that question as well?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, by the way. Yeah, in Turkey, I was planning to going back to my field actually during this summer, but I couldn't because of the travel, travel instructions. So, but I was conducting a kind of virtual research because all these technology providers and some farmers as well are using these digital technologies and internet and communication technologies, and there's, the social media. Yeah, I have with farmers and with the technology providers, I have been in contact through social media as well. So I was, doing a kind of digital research. Yeah, during the pandemic, actually, all these self-isolation and some, in Turkey also the restrictions were high, but except for the farmers and farm workers as well. So farming was going on actually still going on, but during the early times of the pandemic, it was not cancelled, and it was through some government precautions, or I don't know how do we call it, but so the farmers and the farm workers are encouraged to continue their farming, so to be able to feed the rest of the country and import and other things. So and also I had chance to read some surveys, some survey-based research actually, with the farmers and the technology providers, and the farmers are mostly getting information about the seeds they are going to use that year, they are going to plant that year, and the pesticides they are going to use that year, mostly through the shops, actually small agricultural shops in Turkey. So during these pandemics, they were, they had to stay at home, so they couldn't have the interactions with the shop owners and all these experts and maybe the engineers and blah blah. So in that sense, they actually were willing to use the digital technologies, the kind of applications from the digital technology providers, and they also the marketing, digital market is also increased through these because they couldn't, the farmers were growing some crops and they couldn't sell them. So through these, at least through these digital farming channels, actually, they had chance to sell their products. So in that sense, as far as I observed and as far as I talked to the farmers and the technology providers, the use of digital technologies in the sense of production and marketing has increased during the pandemic, I can say.
And Becca, thank you, Zia. And Becca, how have controlled environments been affected by COVID and your research?
I'll just speak personally. So it was in March when all of this happened and research at the University of Arizona started getting shut down. But my project is actually considered on paper an essential service in the community because at the height of our production, we were producing upwards of 200 pounds of tomatoes a week, and we could donate those to various community organizations around Tucson. So I got to continue on with my experiment and had more time to run a greenhouse crop production system. So that was positive.
Awesome. I have a question for the three of you. I'm moderating today from Biosphere 2. And back when they were building and designing Biosphere 2, they considered implementing solar panels, using solar as the primary or part of the energy producing source for the biosphere, which is a 3-acre greenhouse. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, solar panels was a hard sell. Efficiency was lower than it is today, and cost was much higher. But as you think about your respective technologies, whether it be urban agriculture, these thin film photovoltaics, and digital technologies used in agriculture, whether it be tracking systems on cows or drones flying over farms, where do you guys see the cost of these technologies kind of falling into place? Will it be 20 years down the line when some of these technologies are affordable for a smaller scale farmer? Is this going to integrate into big industry first and then trickle down to smaller agriculture? Or is this going to come sooner than we think?
All right, well, I'll speak. I think that my example is probably a bit less techie than the other two. But, I spoke about in my presentation how the people who could benefit the most from urban agriculture actually have the least capacity to grow their own food. And that's largely because of the cost of inputs. So these people are really living hand to mouth, where they have to think very carefully about what they're going to spend their money on. So in the examples of successful urban agriculture that we've seen in Southern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of it has come with an NGO or development aid kind of presence. So I think that without outside investment like that, or without buy-in from the government, You know, there are major barriers to households producing urban agriculture at the scale that would really meet their food needs. And I think that like at the scale that we are seeing in cities, like for example, in the pictures I showed from Zambia, the vegetables that they are growing may contribute to nutrition, their nutrition needs. So for example, like tomatoes and spinach and cabbage would help to get the people the micronutrients that they need. But in terms of actually scaling it up so that there's enough quantity of food so that they're not going hungry is a different story. And I think moving forward, what needs to happen is that urban planning really needs to take into account kind of the barriers and the opportunities for urban agriculture. So I know that in Ghana, for example, in West Africa, there are a lot more people engaged in urban agriculture. So what we can try and do is try and learn from cities like those in Ghana to try and say like, well, what are you doing right? And how is urban agriculture feeding into your urban planning? And how can that be integrated into urban food systems planning in relation to the retail kind of system that we're seeing in terms of there's this trend of supermarketization in which supermarkets are spreading. And we know that the role of informal traditional markets are still very important in African cities. So how can urban agriculture be situated in relation to these and be incorporated into planning and policies so that we can get funding for that and we can upscale it to the degree that might be needed to impact food security?
Thank you, Julia. Do either of our other presenters want to chime in here?
Yeah, I can say that, yeah, currently actually these technology providers, public and private initiatives in Turkey are trying to decrease the cost of these technologies for the small farmers actually. It's not just for the industrial production, it's also for the small farmers. So in that sense, the industrial and non-industrial is getting blurred actually. So this kind of category is getting blurred right now because all these technologies are trying to be, promoted for the farmers, small farmers and middle farmers are encouraged to use them. For example, they are relying on the previous, earlier infrastructure actually. It's not a new infrastructure. These technologies are not radically new technologies. For example, the use of smartphones is a great, huge thing actually. The farmers are using these smartphones, and through these smartphones and through a kind of they don't need to use the the satellites, but the little or kind of, I don't know how they call it, but just the kind of cheap materials can be used for the sensoring and monitoring as well. So in that sense, and for example, satellites are mostly taking minute information, actually minutely, every second, or real-time information, collecting real-time information from the data. But some technology providers believe that it's not necessary. So we can make it 15 minutes, each 15 minutes, these technologies can collect the data from the farms, and it will be enough for the farmers to observe to monitor their farms through these 15 minutes information. So in that sense, it will decrease the cost as well. So they are planning to do this kind of tricks, or I don't know, maybe rearrangements into the technologies to make it affordable for the small farmers as well.
And I'll just chime in. I'm not going to make forecasts about when you'll see OPV shade cloths in a greenhouse near you, but what is certain is that the solar energy industry is gaining momentum, and especially in this emerging photovoltaic technology area. So especially with what's happened in the pandemic, people are thinking about greenhouse applications of this technology. People are realizing that global industrial food supply chains don't work. They're uncertain as far as food access and security, and this ties into what Julia is saying as well with urban agriculture. So greenhouses are a way for areas that are otherwise unable to produce food, either throughout most of the year or at some points during the year, to produce food and therefore localize your food system. And that's increasingly obvious and clear in the context of the pandemic. And my technology, this application, is a way to optimize greenhouse crop production. So that's why I think it'll come about sooner than we think.
Thanks, Becca. There's a follow-up question for you from Kara. Did your crops contribute to the SEAC donation to Navajo Nation?
The initial SEAC donation was prior to when we started harvesting from our greenhouse, but I think that there was a second donation, either conducted with Navajo Nation or another indigenous community in Arizona. Either way, that was facilitated by Marat Kassira, my PhD advisor at the Controlled Environment Agriculture Center, also the director of the center. And a lot of produce from the SEAC was donated to communities in need during the initial months of the pandemic. So that was also very positive.
And for Julia, do you feel that some of what you are seeing in Africa could be seen here in the US, such as in areas that are considered food deserts? And that question is from Jameis.
Yeah, thanks, Jameis. I think that there are definitely parallels in terms of food deserts. So just if anyone doesn't know, food deserts typically occur in low-income neighborhoods that don't have, for one thing, spatial access to food. So for example, a development might come up and there's a lack of supermarkets or whatever type of market that people can get food at. And then similar to the other thing that I mentioned earlier, where in these communities, there's only kind of small corner stores where people can buy more processed food. So a food desert affects both people's access to food in general, and then also their access to more healthy and nutritious food. So it can be associated with both undernutrition as well as obesity, which both of which are elements of food insecurity. And in Africa, you know, there's a lot of criticism around the food deserts concept. And largely that's because of this very important role that informal, or they're not always informal, but either informal or formal, but traditional open air markets. So we find these more in countries like Zambia and Kenya that are less urbanized. South Africa is very, very urbanized in comparison. And I think you'll be more likely to find the type of food desert that you're talking about in the US, in a country like South Africa. And yeah, so I think that there's definitely parallels that can be drawn there. But in other African countries, food deserts are definitely a criticized concept because again, it's not that there is no food, it's that people can't afford to buy it. But just in thinking about urban agriculture, and there's always been this kind of like a divergence in the literature between how urban agriculture looks and what the motivations are behind it when we're thinking about a global north versus global south context. And, you know, we see like in the global north, like in the USA, a lot of the literature is around things like food deserts or around like the benefits of urban agriculture from the perspective of sustainability and urban greening and things like that. Whereas in the global south, like most of the urban ag literature is focused on issues around food security and food access and poverty. But like as time goes on, we have seen a convergence in some of these issues. So for example, the community cohesion kind of benefits and the social benefits behind urban agriculture have been observed in, for example, Cape Town in South Africa, and also in North American cities as well. And then the other thing that I recall reading is that urban agriculture often emerges in times of economic crisis. So, and that's true in both North America and, you know, the developed world and in sub-Saharan Africa. So yeah, in addition to urban food deserts, like those are some of the other parallels that can be drawn in this context. So thanks.
Great. Well, we are out of questions and just about out of time. So I want to thank our panelists, Zia, Julia, and Becca, for your wonderful presentations. And this is the first part of our 4-part series. So I would encourage all of our attendees to tune in for next week's talk. And we'll provide the appropriate links and advertising for that series. We did just get one question. Oh, Neil Brock says, excellent talks and discussion. Thank you. So thank you, Becca, Julia, and Zia. Any last words?
Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks all for listening in and for your questions. And thank you, Erin, for moderating.
My pleasure. And we just dropped the link for the recording and to register for other webinars in the chat. So we'll keep that open as you guys make your way out. And again, we've got 3 more of these great presentations from the Carson Scholars cohort. So thanks so much, and we'll see you guys next week.